Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking all about data dashboards. And I can already hear some of you thinking, spreadsheets, charts, not exactly a party in my headphones. But hold on, because the way we visualize data really impacts how we understand the world. And that's always fascinating to me. What do you think?
Absolutely. And what we're diving into today, it's not just about making, those flashy visuals. It's about effective communication, right?
Exactly.
We've got our hands on what seems like some internal guidance, potentially from this company called Lærke, on how they use dashboards to tell stories with data.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so think of it as like a behind-the-scenes look at how they approach sharing these data-driven insights, which I think is pretty cool.
Okay, I like it. Let's unpack this Lærke guide a little bit.
Yeah.
What's the first big takeaway?
Well, it might sound obvious, but they really emphasize knowing who your audience is.
Yeah.
And really understanding their data needs before you even start thinking about what software to use or even design, They even have this whole process outlined called data need refinement, which I think is interesting.
Data need refinement. I like it. It's catchy. But what does it actually look like in practice?
Okay, so imagine you're creating a dashboard,
Yeah.
right? And your boss is like, make me a dashboard to track website performance. That's pretty broad.
Yeah, for sure.
Data need refinement is basically figuring out what specific questions your users are trying to answer. So instead of just a general website performance dashboard, you would really pinpoint those specific user needs. So you'd be like, okay, what are the bounce rates for our key landing pages? Or how does mobile traffic convert compared to, let's say, desktop? Getting specific.
Gotcha. It's kind of like before you build a house, you figure out if your family wants, a cozy cottage or a multi-story mansion.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes sense to me, but I feel like this could easily get out of control, right? You start with a few key questions and you're like, ooh, it'd be cool to see this data point too, or let's throw this one in there.
Yeah, and that's where the Lærke guide emphasizes scoping the minimal viable first solution, which is basically resist that urge to cram everything in there.
Okay.
Focus on telling the most impactful data stories for that initial version. Right? You can always go back and iterate and add more complexity later.
So prioritize. Got it. Now, one thing I found interesting was this idea of curation levels for dashboards. It's like they're saying dashboards aren't one size fits all.
Yeah. They actually use a hierarchy of data needs pyramid to illustrate this idea, right?
Okay.
At the bottom, you've got raw data, which is super useful for data scientists, but it can be really overwhelming for most people.
Yeah, for sure.
But then as you move up this pyramid, the data starts to become more curated, right? You've got visualizations, then you've got insights drawn from those visualizations, and then finally at the very top, you've got fully automated actions that are actually triggered by the data.
Wow. So it seems like choosing the right curation level, it's really about finding that sweet spot between what your users can actually handle and realistically the resources you have available.
Exactly. And I think it ties back to that first point about really understanding your audience.
Right.
Because if you dump a ton of raw data on someone who just needs, a really quick overview, chances are they're going to ignore it. It's a recipe for a neglected dashboard.
Right. Absolutely. Speaking of making dashboards user-friendly, the guide also dives into the design of visualizations. What really stood out to me was how much they emphasized sketching before even opening up the software.
Oh, that's such a crucial step. And I feel like it's something people just skip over.
Yeah.
They're like, let's just get to the fun part.
Yeah.
But the guide really encourages you to just take a step back. Before you even open your data visualization tool, just sketch out potential charts, graphs, whatever you think you might need. Because this helps you to really think critically about, okay, what is it about this data story that I want to emphasize? And how can I use different chart types to actually highlight those elements?
So it's not just about throwing data on a chart and calling it a day. There's a real art to it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, for example, let's say you're trying to visualize those CSAT scores, customer satisfaction.
Yeah.
If your goal is to highlight the overall trend of the scores over time, you're probably going to want to use a line chart, right?
Right. Makes sense.
But if you're trying to show, the percentage of customers who gave a particular rating, like very satisfied versus neutral, then a pie chart or maybe even a bar chart might be a better option.
Okay. It's like choosing the right tool for the job. Like you wouldn't use a hammer to tighten a screw.
Exactly. And And this is where I think understanding these principles is so valuable, even if you're not the one actually building the dashboards.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Because it allows you to be a more critical consumer of, all those data visualizations that we encounter every single day.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. We understand our audience and their needs. We've got our data story sketched out. Now what? How do we actually bring this dashboard to life?
Yeah, so the Lærke guide, it actually gets into the nuts and bolts of building that dashboard. And one thing that really stood out to me was just how much they emphasize making it like an active part of the team's workflow. It's not just a static report.
Right. What's the point of all this work if the dashboard just ends up like gathering dust on a shared drive somewhere, right?
Exactly. They actually have a whole section called Release and Engage, and it's full of practical advice on how to make sure that your dashboard actually gets used.
Okay, I like it.
Like, for example, they talk about the importance of connecting data insights to your team's actual goals. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
They even suggest asking questions like, how will you ensure that your team's, OKRs are connected to those data insights and metrics?
So it's really about weaving that dashboard into how the team actually operates, right? Making it indispensable.
Yes, exactly. Like an indispensable tool, not just an afterthought, which I think is really smart. And they also talk about keeping the dashboard, fresh.
Oh, interesting.
And keeping it relevant.
Okay.
They even go so far as to ask, how will you ensure that the solution, that the dashboard keeps being, clean, fresh, useful, and valuable to the team?
Yeah, it's like they're advocating for regular dashboard maintenance.
Exactly.
And it's like spring cleaning, but for data, Yeah. Out with the outdated metrics, in with the fresh insights.
Yes, exactly. I love that analogy. And they also really emphasize getting feedback, from users throughout the process. Like they pose this question, do users get what they need from this dashboard? And I think that emphasis on continuous improvement, it's something that really resonated with me.
Yeah, it makes you think that building a really successful dashboard, it's less about like technical expertise and more about really understanding how people work with data.
Absolutely. And speaking of how people work with data, the guide also touches on, a really crucial aspect that I think is often overlooked. And it's
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from understanding what your audience needs to designing those effective visualizations and even making sure your dashboard stays relevant. It's really got me thinking differently about how we use data to communicate,
Yeah, and that's a key takeaway from this Lærke guide, I think. Even if you're like, nah, I'm never going to design a dashboard.
Right.
The principles they're talking about, understanding your audience, crafting a clear narrative, choosing the right visualizations, those are valuable for anyone who interacts with data.
Absolutely. We're just surrounded by data visualizations every day. In news articles, on social media, even in those marketing reports we see at work.
Exactly. And it's so easy to just passively consume those visuals without even thinking about the choices behind them.
Oh, yeah.
But I bet after looking at this guide, you'll start looking at those things with a more critical eye.
Oh, for sure. I'm already finding myself asking questions like, why a pie chart here? Why not a bar chart? Or is this really the whole story or just a little curated slice?
It's like you've unlocked a new level of data literacy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're not just seeing charts and graphs anymore. You're seeing the decisions that went into making them.
Yeah.
And maybe even some biases that might be reflected in those decisions.
It's about being a more informed consumer of information, which honestly, in today's world, feels more important than ever.
Precisely. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. Even if you never build a dashboard yourself. Understanding these principles, it lets you engage with data more critically. Ask smarter questions about the information you're seeing.
Couldn't have said it better myself. As we wrap up this deep dive into data dashboards, I think the biggest takeaway for me is this data visualization. It's about so much more than just pretty charts. It's about communication clarity, using data to tell these compelling, insightful stories.